So let's contrast our discussion now to address the free markets and the utility or utilitarian approach of Adam Smith. Adam Smith is known in our history as the author of The Invisible Hand, and he talked about free markets from the perspective of utilitarian. Um, and free markets basically are going to generate more benefits than they would be the case if the government commanded the markets. And so what Adam Smith argues is not the command approach, but the free market approach. So not traditional, not command, but the free market approach. And in that free market approach, he believes that there is a lot more benefit than there are costs when government is not involved. And it's a very utilitarian approach, right? It's greatest good for the greatest number of people, but it doesn't take into account the minority that gets harmed. And that's again, one of the arguments, the flaws of utilitarian perspective, which is we ignore the minority that still gets hurt no matter what. So the argument, though, is private individuals seeking their own ends in a free market will benefit. That if everybody has the right to seek their own ends in a market, everybody will be okay. Of course, that has its problems. So the free hand basically means that supply and demand creates all the conditions that benefit society, and that as the supply goes up, the demand will go up. They'll find an equilibrium point and a price, a contractual price to sell the good, and for a certain price and a certain amount will naturally follow. And that if the supply exceeds too much, it's too much out there, the cost for the price will go down, no one will want to sell, and then it shifts around. So the supply then starts to go down and eventually figures out that equilibrium point. I mean, again, you should have learned this all in your macroeconomics, basic economic courses about the way supply and demand works. The argument from the free market perspective is that resources are efficiently allocated according to supply and demand, which is an example of social utility. It promotes social utility. Does that really happen? Not always, because sometimes the products that are out there, the resources out there are not good quality, but they're the only ones out there. Like, for example, people would argue that, Microsoft is a big company. It's incredibly successful. It's also the only game in town, and it is a subpar product. There were plenty of other software programs that were out there in the early days of the market. WordPerfect, for example, which was a far superior product to Microsoft, but Microsoft situated themselves to take over the marketplace through all sorts of behaviors and contractual agreements, and therefore the sub quality product ended up dominating. That's why when you look at things like VHS versus Beta VCRs, Beta was a far superior product, higher quality, but the VHS standard from all sorts of perspectives ended up winning. Does that mean that the best product will be more efficiently managed when it's out there, that it'll be the best product out there? And the answer is no. So this is where I think free market sort of falls apart for me, because it's not the best product. So why should it dominate the market? And so that's why government, should play a role. Although what he argues is no, that they shouldn't play a role at all. Government should not interfere. It's government's job to provide for societal welfare, and if free market produces the most amount of social good, the government should not intervene. The assumption, though, is that the free market produces the greatest amount of social good. Is that true? That's where the exploration has to be. I don't necessarily agree to that, but I also don't agree on either of the extremes, that it's either all government or it's all free market. I believe that the truth is somewhere in the in-between. So there have been some researchers that have interpreted Adam Smith's early work to talk about the benefits or the most efficient way to allocate resources. And Mises and Hayek both argue that a free market economy, free market system with private property really is the only efficiently efficient way to allocate resources, that individuals and governments cannot be as efficient. And for some things, I think that might very well be true. And for other things, I don't think that's necessarily true. When we think about utilities, I think when governments run government, there's some benefits to having governments manage things like our utility systems, to have roads, and to have health and welfare things like fire departments and things like that. I believe personally, not everybody believes, but I believe that we don't have a very effective medical care system. People will argue that we have wonderful health care here. We do, but it's extraordinarily expensive, and it is probably the number one reason why people go into personal bankruptcy, which is because of the fact that um, they are not able to access and pay for medical care. Medical care is the pricing of medical care is unregulated. Insurance companies have a lot more free reign in what they do, and in a free market economy, when healthcare was a nonprofit system, it worked a lot better. People were much more satisfied with their healthcare. They got better benefits. They got better rates. When it privatized and became for-profit businesses, we saw a lot of more business interference in what doctors could or couldn't do in terms of the care for their clients. We see people being denied care because their insurance refuses to pay for something, even though the doctor knows that that's the best course of treatment for them. So I think businesses that don't have education in medical school should not be making medical decisions for us. So this is where private industry is not good. I do think that we're in a better situation to have a single payer plan, a universal health care plan, which may be managed by the government, because I can't imagine any organization would be able to manage it outside of the government. But that's a separate issue. But we see it works in a whole lot of Western countries, all through Europe. It's all socialized medicine. It's all universal single payer, and it works really well. And if you want more insurance, you pay for more insurance. People can get in and out as they need to for routine care. And so, there are definitely some pros and cons to that. So what are some of the criticisms of the free markets? Number one, some of those assumptions have to do with monopolies. Adam Smith did not envision monopolies or even oligopolies. And supply and demand can force prices down, but at the same time, we've got monopolies that are keeping prices elevated. We look at, all of our gas companies had record profits last year, not record sales, record profits, which meant their expenses were being managed and their profit margin was significantly higher. If they were keeping pace with the costs and just passing on the costs to us as consumers, we would not have seen the gas prices to skyrocket like that. So oftentimes people will blame the president or blame all sorts of things and not put the blame where the blame should be, which is on the government, on the corporations that are setting the prices. Companies like Exxon and BP all made record profits, which is egregious when people are suffering like that. So, and monopolies are a great example that the free market just doesn't work. Oligopolies are another example that the free market doesn't really work, that a small group of people can control the pricing, not officially, because obviously that would be against the law, but unofficially, they control the market. And so it's hard for anybody else to break into it. If it were easy to break into, that'd be one thing, but it's not easy to break into. Manufacturers will try to keep prices down, but since they pay for the resources used to create it, but not all manufacturers pay for their resources. Consider environmental resources. So we're using resources that we don't have ownership of. We don't pay for it. We just get it. We take it. So environmental resources are a concern. That profit is also not a universal motive. Not everybody wants to make a massive profit. And I think when we have companies that are more focused on social justice issues or and corporate social responsibility, we start to see a different mentality when it comes to free markets. And we do what we want to do is to do things that are fair and right for the consumer, that are fair and right for the environments that are impacted by us. Lastly, this notion of social Darwinism. Spencer believed that biological competition can be applied to social structures where only the fittest businesses survive. Um, and there are some arguments for that. But you know, and we see it in some circumstances where lousy businesses fail, but we also see very bad businesses still survive because there's very little competition to enter, that things are done illegally behind the scenes that interfere with good pure competition. And so when we don't have checks and balances, that's where the corruption and the fraud starts to happen. Um, the skills and traits required to survive in business are not analogous to those that allow individuals and species to survive in nature. So those skills and traits, it's just not a good analogy to make because it's not true in all circumstances. They're not parallel systems. He commits a naturalistic fallacy, which occurs when we infer a qualitative status from the way nature works. Nature is this way, therefore this is good and ought to continue. Because that's not always the case either. So is it good that, only the strong survive? What benefit do we have when there's only the strong? Because we start to decrease the gene pool, and it still creates problems. The last theorist we'll discuss regarding free trade is David Ricardo, and it focuses on comparative or competitive advantages. And the notion of comparative advantage is that it is better for countries to focus on what they're good at in terms of the cheapest production, high quality, the whole works, in comparison to other countries where they could do it, but it would be more expensive. And so this way, where I have where I have my comparative advantage might be in producing one thing, you have it in producing another. It's better for me to trade my product to you and you trade your product to me so that we both can benefit from our comparative advantage in the things that we can produce and share that with others, and then we can take advantage of what you can produce because you're sharing it with me or trading with me. We're really not sharing because obviously money is exchanging hands, but that's basically what we mean by the comparative advantage. I mean, again, I'm going down to the most basic explanation of these things in order for you to understand the basic concepts. Um, comparative advantage is obviously far more complex than just that because there's a lot of factors that we have to take into account. So if I can produce goods more cheaply than you and you can do your goods more cheaply than me, it's better for us to just trade those things where we have the most effective production so that we can take advantage of that at each other. And so the cost differences include things like the cost for labor. What kind of skills do the workers have? The climate, and is it a colder climate or a warmer climate? And what effect does that have on what we're doing and the production and services that we offer? What kind of technology is available in the country? How advanced is the technological infrastructure? What kind of equipment is available? How easy is land available and natural resources? Whatever it is that we need in the industrial market to be able to make the products, and then the labor market in terms of what skills they have, and then ultimately what the distribution systems look like in terms of being able to get the products out the door to the end users at the end of the day. Ricardo's argument for comparative advantage is that even if one country could have an absolute advantage across all goods, it is still better for it to specialize and trade with other countries. So even if I have an absolute advantage, it's still beneficial, across all my things. It's still beneficial for me to trade. Opportunity costs make specializing in one product rather than multiple products more effective. So we're actually better off putting all of our efforts into specializing in one product or a small handful of products, and then with the exchange back and forth, I get from you what you're best at, you get from me what I'm best at, and it's still beneficial across the board because I can then do what I do better. Even if I could do better on all of them, I'm going to do really well on the thing that I have the comparative advantage, the largest item that I had the most comparative advantage of, because then I could put all my efforts into that. So let's look at how this works. If you look at England, it costs them 120 worker years to make 100 barrels of wine and 100 worker years to make 100 rolls of cloth. So if you look at them, they have the advantage in, they don't have the advantage in both. Actually, Portugal has the advantage in both. Because for Portugal, it cost them 80 worker years to make the wine and 90 worker years to make the cloth. Now, technically speaking, it is the comparative advantage for Portugal to do both. But if they were to put all their focus on that, it would still be pretty costly. So what they should do is Portugal should produce the wine and export it and trade with England. And England benefits from this because instead of costing them 120 worker hours a year, they could put all their worker hours into making the rolls of cloth, which is less onerous for them because it's only 100 worker years as opposed to 120. And then Portugal is going to, even though it has the advantage on cloth, if they focus all of their attention on the winemaking and England makes the cloth, it only then that's how they trade, and they don't have to use worker hours making the cloth there. So the goal is to look, first of all, in each column to see which one has the advantage, and it's usually the one with the lower worker cost that has the advantage. And in this situation, Portugal has the advantage in both. But England really, it costs England way too much to manage the barrels of wine. It's much cheaper for Portugal to do it. So it's better for England to import the wine and export the cloth. And this way it's a win-win for both parties. And then Portugal focuses on what it wants to do and England can focus on the cloth, and it's still a better situation for both of them. In this example, this is production without trade, which basically means that England and Portugal don't specialize. They both decide to do both. And England uses 220 workers and Portugal uses 170 workers. But both still produce the barrels and the rolls of cloth as they want to. It's just less costly for Portugal. So the previous slide talked about that absolute advantage that Portugal has and how even then it still would be beneficial for them to trade, to give them their attention one way or the other. But the absolute advantage definitely demonstrates that Portugal across the board has less worker hours that they need to utilize to make the same production that England does. And the production without trade means it's still going to cost us a total of 220 workers for England to make those wine and the wine and cloth, and 170 workers in Portugal to make wine and cloth. So you can see how it's still easier for Portugal to be able to do this. In this example, we see that the comparative advantage of England over Portugal is that England can produce more effectively 220 rolls of cloth, whereas with wine, not so much. Portugal can produce 212 barrels, and so this is a better situation across the board for Portugal to handle the wine and for England to handle the cloth. So this illustrates how England has the comparative advantage on cloth and Portugal has the comparative advantage on wine, so that no matter what, you still get the production of 212 barrels of wine and 220 rolls of cloth, but the comparative advantage is for Portugal on the wine and England on the cloth. So Ricardo's argument has become the standard bearer for why people favor globalization and free trade. People refer to Ricardo's work on comparative advantage and why that is ultimately the goal for doing that. But there are a lot of criticisms for Ricardo's work. That it is first one and the most important one is that while it sounds really good in theory, it's just in practice it doesn't hold up, as it happens with many types of theories, and even economic theories for that matter. That they all sound good on paper, but in reality we don't take into account human decision making and the human factor when it comes to those sorts of things, and ultimately humans are unpredictable. So of course, even if it sounds good in theory, how it should be doesn't mean that it is or ever would be appropriate to do that. It also has a couple of very problematic assumptions. One, it assumes that resources are static and remain in one country, and we know that doesn't work. People move, raw materials can be developed in different countries. When McDonald's goes into another country to develop a McDonald's stores, I mean, even something as simple as McDonald's, we see this, right? They go and they look for wheat and beef and produce that meet their needs, their quality demands. Whether or not you want to believe McDonald's has quality products is a separate argument entirely, but they have a quality standard that they're looking for. And if they don't find it in that country, they will invest in the local community to develop that. And so we can see how resources don't necessarily remain static. So if you've got companies that are willing to invest in developing better resources in a particular area, we can see how resources don't stay static, that only England is great at the cloth and only Portugal is great at wine. I mean, with that argument, who would buy, American wines? Because the assumption was France always did it so well, so why would we go anywhere else? Well, because resources can be developed. We see this in Herman, Missouri, which is in Missouri across the river. And in Herman, German immigrants came from Europe and settled there, and they developed their own wine and grapes and started creating their own wines very similarly to the way they did in Germany. And so Herman, Missouri is known for some pretty high quality wines that competes at an international level, because these are people that took resources from Germany, brought the ideas, the knowledge, the materials here, and they developed their own wine industry here. So you can see how resources can easily be developed in other countries. They don't remain only in one place. Number two, it talks about production being constant, but remember, production isn't constant, that it's affected by all sorts of things. It's affected by economies, it's affected by weather conditions, it's affected by individuals and wars and all sorts of things. And then lastly, that workers can easily move from one country to another. It assumes that workers would just simply move where it's more efficient, and that doesn't always work. People can't always pick up and move like that. So we can see how, while these are great in theory, they make sense in many respects, that it's a flawed notion. It has some flaws to it about how we can maximize our comparative advantage. No system is perfect. The pursuit for perfection it interferes with our ability to be excellent. So we're always looking for the perfect system, and there really is no such thing as the perfect system. We can just do the best we can, finding the best system possible.